Hey there everyone. Happy days after Valentine's Day. Apparently you all survived it, so congratulations. So for this one, I went into it knowing I wanted to paint a lady with horns. That was about it. And I knew my color scheme. I knew I wanted to do something with teals and blues because I was recently admiring them together. As always, the first steps are the sketch and thumbnails, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. For the sketch, I compiled a bunch of references, which I usually do when it comes to painting people. This one was a conglomeration of about 3 to 4 different photos put together, including a few reference photos I took of myself just to see how a neck looks when tilted at this somewhat unique angle. So I do a basic sketch of the head shape first on one layer, and then I lower the transparency of that layer and make a new layer, and then refine the details on a new sketch over it. I find it helps me to keep my proportions correct so I'm not accidentally erasing some of the lines, the guidelines that I'd originally made by doing it all on one layer. So sometimes I'll flip back to that lower layer though and add in a few more reference lines like where the nose and lips should be placed, and then I'll go back on the top layer and sketch them in. Then I made a rough background of the colors I wanted and started playing around with different types of horns in a sketch. Sometimes I'll do this on the thumbnails and sometimes I'll do it in a sketch. It really depends. Once I finally got the ones I wanted, I started in on making a thumbnail of the painting. And making a thumbnail, or several thumbnails sometimes, is something that really helped me to bring my painting to new levels. There's definitely something to be said for knowing basically what your painting will look like before you create it. And I'm not talking about the details. The details you can still add in and still have surprise you. But I'm talking about the basic shapes of the painting, which is what you see when you zoom way out and make it really small. That's the stuff that that the painting is made of, really, and you need to make sure it looks right before you really get started on those details. So that's what thumbnails are for. So for the thumbnails, once I have some very basic shapes blocked out in the painting for where things will go, I will make something that looks kind of like an Andy Warhol painting, but it's actually just a way to try out different nuances and colors and shapes in a painting. So number 1 is what I had to start with. For the second one, I thought, what if I make her horns smaller? I wasn't sure about that, so I thought, okay, what if I made them a lot smaller, which is number 3. I decided I liked them large though. I mean, this girl is gonna have some crazy neck strength to hold up these huge horns I'm giving her, but that's okay. She's a supernatural creature, so she can. Then for the fourth one, I was like, okay, what if I shift the background slightly towards the greens? Even though I knew I wanted blues and teals, I wanted to try it out, and it completely shifts the mood of the painting. So I decided I like what I had to begin with. For number 5, I'm like, what if I made her skin a bit more pink or desaturated? Actually, pink and desaturated. And then what if I made her skin darker and desaturated, which is number 6? Or, hey, let's make both her skin and the background more saturated and see how that looks in number 7. I think I also brightened up the background there too. And then number 8 is basically the change that came out of all this, the ear shape and her hair. I tried her with some ringlets falling over her shoulder and I liked it, so I kept it. And I changed the shape of her ear, which I felt like was conflicting with the shape of her horn. So now it falls right into the curvature of the horn, and it just looks more pleasing to me, so I decided to keep it. So here I'm making those changes and adding some reds to the darkest shadows of the painting as a contrast color. So now we have the oranges of her skin and the reds inside the blacks to contrast and complement the cyan and blue in the background. Another thing I want to point out in this painting, because it's particularly relevant, the highlights on her skin are going to tend more toward the teal and green end to help tie in that background. Because the ambient colors of the painting are so teal blue, that means that the color in the atmosphere and in the light that's hitting her face will be as well. So that's the tone of the highlights that I put on her cheekbones, etc. But you can't just jump from a pretty desaturated peachy color straight to the blue highlights. You need what's called a transition color. Or else the blending of those two colors together is going to look all muddy. That's because whenever you mix two colors together like this, they become more desaturated as they mix. See the saturation level over on the right in my colors palette when I eye drop to grab these two colors on the ends? decently saturated. Then I check the middle, almost gray with much less saturation. Now, in some paintings, that may be a look you're going for, and you can just leave it as it is. But the more you blend those colors, the more your neutral skin tone is going to be getting washed out. So you introduce saturation into the mix again by taking a saturated orange and putting it right there in the middle along with the other mixing of colors. And see how the colors immediately pop against one another again? And if you use the sponge tool set to saturate and just go in and saturate the first example, you get kind of the same effect, although it's introducing some yellows into it that you may not want there. So it's really best to use your own colors with the brush tool and have better control. This was another thing that really helped to make my digital painting immediately look less amateurish as I started to introduce it and use it in my paintings. So you'll notice at this point, this is where I started to decide that I wanted my darks to not be so dark. I wanted to tend toward the darker blue and darker red for the deepest shadows part of the spectrum and bring in more of those blues that I talked about earlier. I didn't keep it right away, but I was playing around with it at this point, and I do introduce it back again later on. So this lack of contrast is something I was actually going for as an interesting effect in this one. Generally, people go and add more contrast and add more contrast because it helps to make your painting pop. It really does. So this was a specific effect that I was going for with this painting. I did it a bit in my painting December also with the deep purples for darks instead of almost black. Many digital painters will use black incorrectly, actually. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit while you watch me paint really, really fast. First off, don't use it to shade your painting. Shadows aren't black. Nothing in this world is actually a true black unless you're in space or maybe really deep in a cave. Anyway, the introduction of light to allow you to see things automatically means black isn't black. Your eyes just interpret it as black. So don't use pure black in your paintings as a rule. There's always exceptions to every rule, but generally. So especially don't use it as a shading color. Adding black to a color is immediately going to desaturate that color you're adding it to, which is good. Shadows tend to not have much color to them, but if they do have a color, it's usually blue or purple. We've already established that adding one color to another and mixing them ends up with a less saturated color. So adding a grayish blue or a grayish purple will desaturate that color as well, but it will be a more realistic shadow color. Things just don't look real when you have shadows, midtones, and highlights all within the same hue. So skin, you think skin is peachy colored, so it should be peachy colored all over. No, the highlights will depend on what kind of light is bouncing off the skin to make it visible to us. Sunlight brings in yellows to those highlights, for example, and shadows or blue or purple because that's where the yellow from the sunlight is unable to reach, therefore making the shadows tend more toward the blue end of the spectrum. So taking this idea and running with it can make your paintings look more interesting and different by basically using complementary colors, or those that are across from each other on the color wheel, to do highlights and shadows. So red light equals reddish highlights equals greenish shadows. Not deep green, mind you, unless you're going for a level of surrealism or some kind of psychedelic effect. Just a small amount mixed in at a very low opacity. So using my painting as an example, the light from the ambient atmosphere is adding that cyan blue/green tones to the highlight. So what's opposite blue-green on the color wheel? Red-orange. Hence the very small amounts of red to my shadows. So it's all these different plays with light and shadow that make skin not just peach. You can immediately tell a beginning painter by looking at their skin tones and seeing that all the skin is within the same hue of peach, highlights and shadows alike. We all did it at one time or another, even if it's only in childhood, because then you go on to have an art class that teaches you better, even if they don't teach you the color theory behind it immediately. In digital painting, I think it's especially easy to do because, well, especially if you use those dreaded dodge and burn tools to paint shadows and highlights. The tools do have helpful uses, mind you, just not for painting shadows and highlights in digital painting. So if you check out my DeviantArt page, there is a link in the description of this video, and then go to my gallery and click on scraps. You will see some of my older stuff where I did exactly what I'm talking about, looking especially at the painting called Shattered. It's exactly what I'm saying. Her skin is all one hue. So vary that color. It's that variance of color that brings both vibrancy and realism to your work. Mind you, I'm not saying to put down deep blue shadows on your peach skin in full force. Just use a low opacity brush, using that color to deepen the shadows slowly. When you do it, you'll see, as I do it here, the hue starts off still close to that peach in color or hue. It just gets slightly darker and slightly less saturated. But if you watch carefully, over on the right hand side, and watch my color palette, it also moves slightly down the color wheel and into more of the reds as it gets darker and less saturated. So then more and more towards the red as you get darker and less saturated, until finally it bypasses red and goes into the purples, and then finally blues. So somewhere in the middle of that, in between the peach and the blue, should be your shadows, in this particular example. Okay, so getting back to my painting. And sorry about all that color theory, especially if you already knew it. I do have a lot of watchers that are beginning digital artists though, so I'm really trying to touch on a lot of the techniques that did the most for me to help my painting. There's one more technique I wanted to share with you for this tutorial, which was actually the entire reason for this painting, amusingly enough. The caps on her horns and the engravings on them. There's a technique that uses the bevel and emboss tool that you can use to create engravings like this, as well as textured rocks and all kinds of other things. But I wanted to try it for engraving. I've never tried this before, but it seemed like a decent shortcut for intricate designs where you don't want to have to put highlights and shadows individually for a really ornate design on an engraving. So what you do is you paint the surface first. So I've got the gold caps on her horns on their own layer. Then I duplicated that layer. On the top layer, I added a bevel and emboss layer style, and I made sure to use the highlights and shadows with the right colors and not just black and white, as we've already talked about. So in this case, it's varying shades of gold tinged with cyan, which ends up kind of a green color. So you can see the color palette for the gold right above the right horn cap. And I'm putting up the bevel and emboss settings that I used so you can see them as well. Then go and either erase using the eraser tool, or better yet, using a layer mask if you want to be able to more easily fix any mistakes. So add the layer mask using the add a layer mask button, and then paint on it in black, where the black is the erased parts. And then you can paint white over it again to fix those mistakes. Hopefully that made sense to you. If it didn't and you're unfamiliar with how to use the layer mask tool really, then just use the eraser tool and the undo button. You will get the same effect. So the concept behind this is that the part that you're erasing is the design that you're creating. It will add that bevel emboss effect to immediately add those highlights and shadows and create an engraved look. There's a key step that you have to do at the end as well, which the tutorial that I was reading didn't even touch on, but creating that bevel effect will mess up the edges. So at the end, once you're done with your ornate design, you need to rasterize the layer. You can right click on it and rasterize the layer that way. That will add the bevel effect that you already wanted, but remove the layer style that continues to apply the beveling. So you can then go in and erase around the edges of that top layer where the beveling was added and you didn't want it there. So now you have a really cool looking ornate bevel effect thingy, and you saved yourself a ton of time doing it. So I must say I was pretty happy with this actually. So now back to the painting and some of the choices I made on it. I really liked the spiky armor coming out of her skin, and I may do that for a future painting where I'm sure that what I'm painting is a demon, but I wanted the ambiguity to this one, and I also wanted not too much detail towards the bottom end of the painting, so I went with a simpler scale mail type dress design in the end. I like the way it turned out too, and it doesn't draw the eye like the spikes were. I wanted the focus to be her face, her horns, and the ornamentation that I am now adding to them. I had a lot of fun playing with the jewelry for her, half of which I didn't even use. I had a ring and a choker at one point, but I decided against them. I absolutely love how it gets transformed when I added the jewelry to the bases of her horns though. Something about those shapes was really pleasing to me and really jazzed it up. I also decided to add the chain of the necklace so it was draping over one of her fingers on that hand that she's holding up for some actual interaction between the hand and something else in the painting. By the way, when painting gems like what's on her necklace, at least if they're large ones, do yourself a favor and get a reference. It will make the gem look so much better in the end because Lake does some really crazy stuff when it comes to cut gems, creating all kinds of shapes that you'd never have thought to add yourself. One other thing I wanted to point out that I really loved about this one is the atmospheric depth. Now usually you don't get that in a portrait, but I decided to add it to this one. Notice how her horn is kind of fading off as it gets further away, and her hair is also kind of fading off as it gets further back. Rather than blurring that stuff or adding less detail, I wanted to try to add some atmosphere to it, so it's like it's fading off into the background. It's misty out or something. But mostly it was just an effect I just wanted to try out that I ended up really liking. I also really loved the textures to this one. So that's about it, I think. What did you think of her, or this tutorial, or life in general? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear it. And be sure to subscribe to my channel if you're not already. Once I get to 100 subscribers, I can have a much easier to remember channel name / URL. So that's my current goal. Help me achieve it. And I may even do a special thank you video as a result of it. Thanks for watching, everyone.